You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 13th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Ahead on today's programme.
Принять решение о том, что страны НАТО напрямую участвуют в военном...
Vladimir Putin warns the West of the consequences of allowing Ukraine to use British-made long-range missiles against Russia. The United Nations is doubling down on calls for a ceasefire in Gaza. We'll look at corruption and criminality amongst the elite of Cambodia. Plus, we'll consider the upcoming report on the future of EU competitiveness to be released on Monday. And... we'll reflect on Pope Francis's tour of Asia. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. Vladimir Putin has issued a stark warning to the West over the potential use of British-made long-range weapons within Russian territory. He's also accused 6 British diplomats of spying and withdrawn their accreditation. Well, joining us now is James Rogers, who's Associate Professor of International Journalism at City University in London. James, welcome back to the show. What has Putin said with regard to weapons?
Well, he said, in effect, that if has been largely discussed in the media and, of course, was raised in that joint visit by the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy and the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Kiev earlier this week, that if Western powers accede to Kiev's request to allow them to use these long-range weapons against Russia, Putin will pretty much consider that Russia is at war with NATO. So it is potentially a very serious escalation. Of course, Georgina, the timing here, not coincidental, of course, because the British Prime Minister is in Washington to meet President Biden today. And one very much imagines that this is a subject that will come up in their discussions.
Did Putin say exactly how Moscow would respond to this? What action are they likely to take? Did he specify?
No, he didn't specify that. And from one point of view, of course, this is not the first time that he's threatened that any sort of, we had this over the supply of warplanes. That has happened without any obvious escalation. But of course, the supply of warplanes to Kiev did not necessarily mean that there would be any strikes on Russian territory. And this, of course, comes at a time when since, early last month, Kiev launching that surprise attack on the Kursk region of Russia and succeeding in taking a good deal of territory there, a counterattack, if you like, a military operation inside the territory of the Russian Federation. So it is in a slightly different situation, of course. And this is something that, the way that people in Moscow generally can tend to go about their normal lives at the moment. But of course, any sort of further attacks on Russian territory might bring home to the wider Russian population the fact, a reminder that their country is in fact at war with a neighbouring nation.
Considering what Putin said in the past when he's been questioned on this, might part of the response be supplying similar weapons to countries who might want to deploy them against Russia's perceived enemies? And if that were the case, which countries would he mean and who would be the targets?
Well, I think Putin just wants to keep people guessing. I think what he's doing by raising these threats is trying to influence the decision-making that is likely to go on, the discussions that's likely to go on between the British Prime Minister and the President of the United States in Washington today. And I think this is really what this is about. This, of course, is a time as well when Russia itself is said to have received weapons from Iran. This is something which the Iranian authorities have denied and said it was made up. But of course, both sides in this conflict, after 2.5 years of war, are, suffering shortages, particularly even Russia, with its great military resources and a large amount of military manufacturing capability. So this, I think, is Putin trying to raise the stakes in the hope of not giving his enemy in Ukraine any greater resources.
Clearly, the expulsion of these 6 British diplomats is part of the same row. What's the detail on that?
Well, it's very interesting. Actually, Georgina, I've been reading the Russian media just in preparation for our discussion now, and there's some Interestingly, as you may have seen in other media reports, the Russian authorities have actually named and published photographs of these 6 British diplomats who they say that for whose accreditation they say they have withdrawn. And the TASS news agency is also giving this sort of something of a sort of John le Carré air as well, with quoting what they describe as a member of the special services, the Russian special services, talking about saying, quite honestly, we're tired of this circus. They're saying, and the Russian media are claiming that now, with the expulsion of these 6 people, let's remember the Foreign Office in London has said that the accusations are absolutely baseless. But with the expulsion of these 6 British diplomats, it will become almost impossible for Britain to carry out any espionage activities in Russia. I mean, this comes again just yesterday. Was a statement issued from the Russian embassy in London, which was also reported on TASS, which was in effect accusing, Britain really of coordinating a lot of assistance for what they termed the Ukrainian terrorists. This is how Russia refers to its foes, of course, in many of its official pronouncements.
James, just before we go, I wondered if we could have a quick look at what's going on in Pokrovsk in northern Ukraine. How significant is this town, and what military operations surround it right now?
Well, this town is highly significant because it's one of the parts of the Donetsk region of Ukraine which Russia has laid claim to, in fact, which President Putin has claimed that Russia has formally annexed, but which it doesn't yet control. It is strategically extremely important because whoever holds Pokrovsk is able to mount more military operations in the surrounding area. And the Russian army does seem to be making some progress there. Of course, it's extremely difficult to tell without access to the battlefield, the extent to which they are, but it does seem to be that they are making progress there, and it would be a significant stage in the war where Russia to be able to take control of Pokrovsk.
And is Ukraine still pushing into Kursk?
They seem to be suffering some sort of, Russia is mounting some sort of counterattacks with some success, although the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is saying that this is all part of their plan all along. You'll remember that they've said they never want to hold this territory. If there was a purpose to this attack on Kursk, it was probably not to conquer the territory so much as to have a political purpose, to show the Russians and their own people, indeed, that they are able to mount an attack like this, and possibly to attract away resources from other fronts in the war. But I don't think there's any serious expectation, and the Ukrainians have said all along they don't intend to hold the territory. And it does seem now that the Russian counterattacks are underway.
James, thank you very much indeed. That was James Rogers. Now, here's Monocle's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. Boeing's US factory workers have gone on strike after 96% of them voted for a walkout. The workers walked off the job after overwhelmingly rejecting a contract deal, halting production of the plane maker's strongest-selling jet as it struggles with severe output delays and heavy debt. China will raise its retirement age for workers, which is now among the youngest in the world's major economies, in an effort to address its shrinking population and aging workforce. The Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, the country's legislature, passed the new policy today after a sudden announcement earlier in the week that it was reviewing the measure. And Elon Musk has called the Australian government fascists in a post on X over new legislation aimed at tackling deliberate lies spread on social media. Under proposals by Australia's centre-left Labour Party government, platforms could be fined up to 5% of global annual revenue if they allow the spread of content that is misleading, deceptive, or likely to contribute to serious harm. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thanks, Carlotta. To Israel now. UN Chief Antonio Guterres reiterated his demand for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza following the Israeli Defense Forces bombing of a UN school sheltering displaced people. At least 18 people died, of whom 6 were UN aid workers. Yossi Meckelberg, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House, speaks to us often from here in London, but he's actually in Tel Aviv today. Yossi, this is the first time you've been back to Israel since October the 7th. How are you finding it? What's the atmosphere and how have things changed since you were last there?
Good afternoon, Georgina. I arrived actually last night, so I'm kind of only a few hours here. And you feel it, from the airport that there are very few international airlines that arrived to the main airport in Tel Aviv. And it was actually had an interesting conversation. It was really late at night with the taxi driver, who happens to be an Israeli Palestinian. And he said, it's difficult right now, barely any tourists here. So you feel also you feel kind of the economic impact. But the first thing that really hits you in the airport is the photos of the hostages. And this really, some go very quickly because they want to get out of the airport, but you stop one by one and you see the faces of these people that are nearly a year now in Hamas tunnels. So this is the kind of, you feel the atmosphere. Tel Aviv usually is a kind of very happy city. It's not as it's, I think when I was here last time.
Let's turn to the United Nations now. What's Israel's version of this attack on the UN school?
I think it's a kind of the same story we cover time and again in the middle of the war. On the one thing, yes, there is a possibility that Hamas is using, and they're using civilians as a human shield. The IDF, the Israel security forces, they're after these Hamas people, and they make a decision that regardless of the unacceptable behavior of Hamas of using civilian as human shield, Israel will still go after Hamas militants. And at the same time, if as a result of this many civilians are killed, the approach is so be it, which is also unacceptable. So we're in this situation time and again, and that's where again we'll go back to what from the beginning of this war, what President Biden always wanted: a democracy, a country that respects the rule of law and international humanitarian law should behave differently, even if they're after people after their enemy.
Is this likely to strengthen the UN's resolve to achieve a ceasefire?
I think it should, but then we get to the question: how can the UN enforce if the Security Council can't pass a resolution? And even if there is because the United States would block it, and even if there is a resolution by the Security Council, what measures the UN is ready to take in order to enforce a resolution, we are in the same place. And that there is and it's a basic problem in global security, of enforcement and compliance with UN resolutions. So there will be probably in the General Assembly another resolution. It won't pass in the Security Council. But what we need to hope that is going to, where a change might take place, is through the negotiation. And then we'll look at the mediators, the United States, Qatar and Egypt.
Well, what's the state of the negotiations at the moment?
Probably in a stalemate. And I think the problem is with the leadership of both sides, Israel and Hamas, don't put a ceasefire and the premium on a ceasefire as their top priority. They look at other priority, including their own survival, or some would argue mainly their own survival. And they don't see that ceasefire will actually prolong for one reason or another, their survival. So we are stuck again without the mediators, including the United States, that it's in the midst of a presidential election and congressional election, not ready to use its force and influence in order to make it happen. And my fear, if you look at the experience and the history of this kind of wars, when at the beginning you think that, they can come to an end relatively quickly, the longer they drag on, the more there is the possibility that they become a so-called the new normal, which is not normal for the people who live through it, and it might drag on for years.
Finally, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas will be in New York for the UN General Assembly. Is it likely that the Security Council will approve full Palestinian membership of the organisation?
Yes, sadly not. And I think, again, the United States will veto it. And I don't think that the UK so far is ready to recognize Palestinian statehood. So as long as the structure of recognition in any country's statehood, it has to go through the Security Council, and the P5 has the veto power or right. This is not going to happen, not on this occasion, on the 79th General Assembly session. And we have to look into more the cases of state by state recognizing Palestinian statehood than this global organization doing it.
Yossi Meckelberg in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much indeed. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Let's turn our attention to Cambodia now. The US has announced it will impose sanctions on the businesses of a leading tycoon over his treatment of trafficked workers and involvement in the online scam industry. Lee Yong-fat is a senator from the ruling Cambodian People's Party, the CPP, a member of its Central Committee and an advisor to the former PM and current Senate President Hun Sen. Neil Lachlan, a lecturer in comparative politics at City University, joins me now. Neil, I wondered if you could start by giving us an overview of the political landscape in Cambodia and how that's created an environment in which crime and corruption amongst the elite can thrive. What are the origins of Cambodia's corrupted political economy?
Sure, thank you. Well, Cambodia is an authoritarian country. It's been ruled by the Cambodian People's Party since 1979. And illicit money has for a long time been central to the kind of survival of the ruling Cambodian People's Party. You know, we see a legacy of this in illegal logging, where tycoons linked to the ruling party were allowed to get incredibly wealthy, land dispossession, of which Leon Pat, who you mentioned, is a kind of leading actor. And now we see a lot of illicit money coming in through this online scammy operations linked to mainland Chinese criminal networks that are operating in Cambodia. So for a long time, this kind of illicit money has been a factor in Cambodia's political economy. And the reason why people like Leon Pat are so important is because, you know, tycoons in Cambodia donate money to the ruling party, and they build lots of things in the name of the ruling party, and they're really central to the legitimacy of the whole operation, the political operation in the country.
How is the current Cambodian leadership dealing with this?
It's dragging its feet, to be honest. And I think this is because a lot of senior tycoons who are politically connected in Cambodia are linked to this scamming operation. Leon Pat, as you mentioned, is a CPP senator, Cambodian People's Party senator, leading OCNIA. He has business dealings with the ruling family. He's an advisor to Hun Sen, who was the former prime minister, and Hun Manet. And really this makes this kind of very difficult for the party to deal with, if they want to deal with it at all. So we've seen kind of an attempt to crack down on this, but there's been lots of official foot dragging, and really this is because this money is kind of central to how the whole system operates in Cambodia.
You've talked about a criminal crossover between Cambodia and China, and just looking at that relationship and the very delicate balancing act that Cambodia needs to tread, but also the US. I mean, I wonder how useful US sanctions against Cambodian businesses are, given that Washington needs to maintain a balance of power. It needs to engage with Cambodia, especially on maritime security, on humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and so on within the region.
Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously only so far these sanctions can go, but, you know, Leon Pat is a major actor in Cambodia. He's connected to the ruling family and such like. So I think this will have some significant implications. And it's also a warning to other tycoons, many of which are also implicated in these operations. And it does exist within this kind of broader context of Sino-US relations within Southeast Asia. Cambodia is very close to China. There's a military base in Cambodia, which has been significantly upgraded by the Chinese, which is causing a lot of disquiet in Washington. So it kind of links into this whole, increasing geopolitical contest we're seeing between the US and China that's playing out in Southeast Asia, with Cambodia now emerging as a kind of node in this contest.
And so where does Cambodia's heart lie when it comes to the kind of tussle between the US and China?
I think Cambodia for itself is trying to forge a path between these two great powers. A lot of investment in Cambodia comes from China. There aren't the sanctions from China on Cambodia that they are from the US. The US also reduced its generalized systems of preferences for Cambodian exports recently to the US market, which is a huge deal in Cambodia, which exports particularly garments to the US, Europe, and other places. So I think Cambodia is trying to navigate this path, but ultimately China is proving to be a much more supportive backer of Cambodia's authoritarian regime, because it has these investment without ties attached, and it has relations without ties attached. And that's attractive for Cambodia, particularly in a context where we've seen crackdown on the political opposition, freedom of expression and such like. So I think for the regime itself, it's moving closer to China, and Cambodian people itself have themselves kind of shown that they don't want to be caught within this kind of battle between two great superpowers. It didn't work out very well the last time.
Neil, thank you. That's Neil Loughlin there. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, Mario Draghi, the former president of the European Central Bank, will deliver his report on the future of EU competitiveness on Monday. Requested by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen over a year ago, the contents are keenly anticipated and likely to prove controversial. Well, joining me in the studio now is Nina dos Santos, who's an international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor. Hi, Nina. Welcome back.
Hello, Georgina.
We're told this report is around 400 pages long, but there are 5 key points to look out for. What are those?
That's right, 5 among 170 proposals in this book that is so weighty you could probably use it as a doorstopper here. The ones that have been sort of focused on by the press, particularly in Brussels, include money, the need for huge amounts of capital investment. What we're talking about here is proposals to spend between 750 and 800 million euros per year to boost the bloc's competitiveness. That is a whopping 4.4 to 4.7% of the bloc's GDP every single year. Now, he says that he wants a lot of that to come from the private sector, but we don't really at this point know how much. Trying to get all EU countries to shoulder the financial burden of that together, we'll remember, is really difficult after all the impasses a decade or so ago that we saw during the Eurozone crisis. Some of the other points to look out for are what he wants to see is new rules for banking, especially when it comes to investing in technology to make risky investments more attractive, more support for the banking sector. Some of his critics may say, well, that's hardly surprising, considering, as you said in your introduction, Georgina, that he was a central banker and was also a Goldman Sachs banker many years ago. He's also talking about sort of joining up the power grid, electrifying the EU, readying it for the green technology challenge, because remember that the EU did set a whole raft of new regulations on this just last year, but it's missing, many say, a coherent strategy. And then the other 2 things that it includes is combating protectionism from the United States and China, so issues of trade and how to tackle tariffs there versus those 2 countries. And the last point is that he wants to do all of this within the context of staying true to those crucial EU values that at the moment, Georgina, as we've seen in the last week, still are under threat because fewer and fewer people across the bloc appear to believe in them.
Absolutely. I wonder how binding these suggestions are and if there is likely to be pushback.
That's a really important point because Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, who's now embarking upon her 2nd term in that all-powerful role, actually delayed her announcement of the College of Commissioners. These are the 27 portfolios of the commissioners that go to all these different important bureaucrats from each state, till next week. So we're going to have the publication of this report on Monday, and a couple of days later, the announcement of who gets which portfolio. And already she's kind of set the legislative agenda for the next term in the Commission. So the question is how much will this be able to inform her thinking and those 27 commissioners' thinking from hereafter? This, by the way, I should say, is not the only piece of work that she's commissioned from a former Italian technocratic prime minister. This is one of 2 enormous tomes that have been published over the summer about the single market, and this one on competitiveness. The last one was done by Enrico Letta just a month or so ago. And again, the message was more Europe, not less, and it'll cost more.
Yeah. Well, as we know, Europe's facing fierce competition from China, particularly over electric vehicles. And now we hear that production of the electric Fiat 500 has been halted for lack of European orders. I wonder what's causing this slowdown in demand for really what is an iconic brand.
Yes, that's right. I lived in Italy for many years and I really enjoyed driving Fiat 500s, but unfortunately they weren't electrified back in those days. And as we know, European car makers have had a really hard time trying to make sure that they had the right sort of technology and that they've been able to stimulate the market for electric vehicles. Now, obviously, companies like Italian car makers, like Fiat, bought companies like Chrysler, partly for this type of technology. But the reality is there have been supply constraints over the COVID pandemic. And also, there have been differing amounts of subsidies and an incoherent strategy in terms of sort of weaning customers and drivers off of, as I was saying before, vehicles that are used to using petrol or maybe hybrid to entirely electric vehicles. And as I was saying in that Draghi report, there hasn't really been the electricity grid that's joined up enough to cope with all of this demand. And there isn't the infrastructure in terms of charging stations. So, surprise, surprise, customers aren't ordering as many of them. And as such, they've sort of, despite the fact that they spent huge amounts of money trying to upgrade facilities to make these vehicles, they're having to suspend work on them because they don't have enough orders.
Nina, thank you very much indeed. That was Nina Dos Santos. And finally on today's programme, let's have a roundup of Asian news. I'm joined by Erin Cook, who's a Jakarta-based journalist and author of Dari Mulike Mulut. That's a newsletter about Southeast Asia. She's actually calling in from Dili in Timor-Leste. Erin, lovely to have you back on the show. Now, the Pope's just been in the region. How's his tour being viewed and what were the main takeaways of his visit, particularly in Timor-Leste?
It's really hard to overplay the importance of his visit to Timor-Leste. It's a country of 1.3 million people and 90% are Catholics. So it's an enormous deal for the Pope to finally come and visit. 700,000 people at least came out to see his mass on Tuesday. And the excitement hasn't ended. There are kids running around Dili pulling down banners for him as a bit of a keepsake, and it's all anyone can talk about still.
But across the rest of the region, he's been to some countries, many countries that were just mostly Islamic or Muslim countries. How did he go down there?
Yes, he had a huge welcome in Indonesia, in the capital there in Jakarta. So Jakarta, of course, not known as a Catholic city in the way that Dili is, but it is a country that believes strongly in religious tolerance. So a leader of the Pope's caliber was strongly welcomed by the president and by the people of Jakarta, who similarly showed out for an enormous welcome at his mass there in the enormous stadium. So his message there was, we need more religious tolerance in the region and Indonesia should be the leader there. And that was taken up wholeheartedly by the president, though some critics said it was a bit of an odd one, given that it's been a few years now that since Indonesia's moved on from its heavy days of religious violence. But yeah, it was well accepted regardless.
Now, I know that he did touch on green issues and environmental issues too. And so let's cross to Vietnam, where the death toll from a typhoon and related landslides is still climbing. What are the details of this terrible natural disaster?
Yes, this typhoon, of course, Vietnam's no stranger to typhoons. There have been many with huge death tolls over the years, but they have sort of died off somewhat in the recent years as climate mitigation policies come into effect. But this one, the death toll is pushing 300 and it's widely expected to climb higher, with around 100 still reported missing. And many provinces are still under floodwaters. They're still trying to get out ankle length, knee-deep water from across the country. So this seems like one that might change the conversation a little bit. Vietnam's been focusing on business and finance, but this might push the country back towards environmental measures.
And finally, there's a very odd story coming out of Indonesia.
Yes, this is a very, very weird one. So the Vice President-elect, Gibran Rakabuming Raka, he's the son of the current president, Joko Widodo. He's been busted, I guess. A former account of his on a very popular Indonesian message board has been uncovered. And he's been using that account in 2017 and 2018 to make all sorts of horrible, misogynistic, sexist comments, but crucially, homophobic comments about his president, Prabowo Subianto, who he ran a very, very strong campaign with this year. homophobic comments about his son. So there's a bit of a friction between these two, and this should push it into open warfare, I'd expect. He still maintains that it's not his account, but internet sleuths all over Indonesia are adamant this was him and he's got to answer for it.
And do you know the name of the account?
Fufu Fafa, which is deeply Indonesian online slang that I'm not sure I'll ever understand, but which is just more evidence that it's him. He is probably not Indonesia's first millennial lawmaker, but certainly its most online millennial. So I think it's been acting as more evidence that it's certainly him.
Erin Cook, thank you very much. And thank you too for gifting me the word fufu fafa, which I shall be repeating all day. That's all for this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researchers were Gunnar Grinlid and Sana Jamani, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. And The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. You can join me on Monocle on Saturday tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.